Hello, in this video we're going to take a look at the history of the Lenormand again, and also take a look at the 12 extra cards that I've chosen to include in the Cyberpunk Lenormand, for which we are now in, at the time of recording, the final 7 days of the Kickstarter campaign, and to give some of my reasons as to choosing these particular cards. So in this slide we can see a photograph that Tali and I took at the British Museum when we went about our rediscovery of the Lenormand and its introduction or reintroduction back into popular cartomancy. Here we can see the Das Spiel der Hoffnung, the Game of Hope, written in German and also in French underneath in the little box that the cards are part of. These are the cards that we have reproduced and now in their 6th edition, licensed from the British Museum, with art touched up and restored by Shiro Marchetti, just to take out some of the rough edges of the cards for contemporary use, but maintain the actual artwork and colouring of the cards, which were likely done by a young person, perhaps at a parlour table, to keep them occupied. So they are certainly not print coloured or professionally coloured in that regard. Now, the Game of Hope came with instructions, which our friend and colleague Steph was the first person to translate this into English. So any English translations of the Game of Hope come from this actual booklet here that we can see at the British Museum. And here we have the instructions for a game. Basically, Game of Hope was a race game where you rolled dice, moved about the cards, and lost or won marks, German currency, or probably it was played with lots or something like that you would gain or lose throughout the game. And as our research demonstrated, the person who actually devised this game, that was published in 1799 and then unfortunately died the following year, was Johann Caspar Hechtel. He was the son of a factory owner. They were based in Nuremberg, and at the time there were a lot of brass factories and also brass for making musical instruments from and so forth. And also Nuremberg at the time was known for its production of games, parlour games, children's games and so forth, and there were a lot being invented. In fact, Hechtel also invented, I think, at least 2 other games, and the Game of Hope was the one that later on was actually then used for the so-called Lenormand cards. And we also know that when the so-called Lenormand cards were produced, that they were produced with what is now called the Philippe sheet, and this is a sort of cobbled across version of what we find in the Amusements of the Germans book, also a copy of which is in the British Museum, and it's a sort of half-inched version of the reading of coffee grounds applied to the actual cards themselves, and then signed off by Philippe the so-called nephew or cousin, or some relationship to some heir, as it says in the pamphlet, to Mademoiselle Lenormand, and that's all entirely a fiction. And we can actually tell from the example reading that is given in this particular pamphlet, we do find similar examples elsewhere. And as I think I mentioned in several other videos, the whole race game idea, and we see this from the Wellcome Institute in London, there are a lot of similar games around the time, and the most popular one, or the one that sets the standard, is the sort of game of the golden goose, or the goose game of goose, which again, you can see some of the images here. There's a well in the yellow circle that is on the breast of the goose there. There's a house underneath. There's a maze or labyrinth towards the tail end of the goose, and so forth. So some of the race games would have their own symbology to them. There's also a dice that you will notice on the goose, and it's just the way that the slide is laid out, the board game is laid out, as to whether it's a goose or some other creature. It doesn't really matter, in the sense of it's still, the mechanics of the game are still a base sort of racing game. You'll also see that there is a bridge card at the base of the neck of the goose in the dark blue there. So these are fairly common occurring symbols within these games. And a lot of them, as we now know, come from the reading of coffee grounds. So there's a sort of built-in divination system into these games through the use of commonly applied symbology. Other places that we see the same symbology are also in lottery sheets, where people would either cut out the sheets to play their own lotteries, or there were more sort of standardized informal or state sanctioned lotteries going on. Sometimes the lottery tickets would use combinations of familiar symbols. So here we can see the book and the flowers and the dog and the scythe down at the bottom, just out of shot, and the birds. We can also see some other symbols that are certainly not in the Game of Hope or the Lenormand, for example, the soldier or the bugle or trumpet, and the hot air balloon. One of the particular games that fascinated Tali and I when we were doing the original research was the Harlequin Takes All game, or the game of chance. Again, it's a very similar layout. Here we have 32 cards, which is of interest to us Kabbalists, because the Tree of Life has 32 paths in total, broken down into 22 so-called paths and 10 Sephiroth, or numerical emanations, and they add up to make 32. And obviously then we have the correspondences to 22 Hebrew letters, to the 22 major arcana, to the 22 paths on the Tree of Life. So there's a lot of base level symbology, almost archetypal numerology built into these things. There's actually a great book called, and I'll have forgotten it because I'm not doing this to a script or anything, but there's a book about dice divination and the divine, or gods and games, I think it's called. It's quite an old book. I've got a copy of it lurking around somewhere, and it does talk about the fascination with these sorts of games and symbology and the way that divination and the random chance of games in terms of gambling all sort of correspond to our engagement with the universe, that we want to turn what we think of as chance or the apparent randomness of the universe into some sort of pattern, and we can do that by divination itself. And so there is a parallel between games and divination, which I find very, very interesting. So here in the game of chance, though, we have symbols like the rake and the house and the labyrinth and the maze, which we'll come back to, the bridge, the dice, the well, which I really personally like as a symbol. And some of these, along with a few others, Tali proposed to Shiro Marchetti when he was developing his Lenormand and wanted to include some so-called extra cards. Tali suggested the ones that would most suit his style, his symbology and so forth, and that's why in Shiro's Gilded Reverie Lenormand you can find cards like the bridge and so forth. They come from suggestions in part from Harlequin Takes All, and Tali drew on a few other things like the mask and so forth that were common symbols in some of Shiro's other decks that also appear in other games, or symbolism of coffee, of the reading of coffee grounds as well. So there's a permeability to these symbols. They move from one system to another. And another place we see these symbols is in so-called charades or lottery charades, popular in all sorts of places around the world, but we actually find similar symbols used. For example, the fish and the rider that you can see here. I think this list of 100 numbers for lottery also has an awful lot of actual symbols that we see in the Lenormand. One interesting layout, although obviously of its time, is of symbols for the so-called Chinese charades or Chinese lottery, and this is of interest as here again we see a similar number of cards to or symbols to the Lenormand, that being 36, which is 6 by 6, which is 2 six-sided dice. So again, there's a sort of parallel to the gaming nature of these things and to the symbolism itself. And when we come to Lenormand cards, here's a weird example from a set of posters that we purchased quite a while ago. They're in old frames and probably, I think, they came from a pub. They were in an English pub somewhere, and we can see an artist has created their own cards, and we can see that they're semi-Lenormand, semi-gypsy cards and semi-tarot. So we can see here we have the fish, the man, the woman, the stork, the house, the key, the tree, the coffin, the star, the bouquet as flowers. But we also have lightning and work, and the Wheel of Fortune, obviously from tarot, in a very abstracted manner. So we can see that there are potential variations of what actually we tend to think of as a sort of standard Lenormand set of 36 cards. So what I chose for the extra 12 cards for the Cyberpunk Lenormand, start off after card 36, so I've just numbered them sequentially because the numbering is semi-important but not that important, I find, to actual readings, other than when we're doing a grand tableau and a chaining from house to house and so forth, which we sort of looked at briefly in the previous video with the idea of knighting. I might do a final video before the campaign finishes about the houses and how we can use those for context and also for chaining through a reading. I think I introduced that in the first video, showing how a grand tableau can be used. But here we have card 37, 38 and 39. The bridge card I felt is quite important. This is again similar to one of the symbols that Shiro was advised to use by Tali, so I've also used it. We have connection, reaching out, meeting halfway, truce, balance, support. To me, it's a sort of like temperance. It's a sort of like in tarot, it's sort of like diplomacy. It allows us to literally connect things together in a situation which I don't think any of the Lenormand cards as they exist particularly has written into it as a straight symbol. And also some of these symbols do really come from the reading of Coffee Grounds as well, from which there's a wealth of symbols, but some sort of more common than others. I guess if you were reading Coffee Grounds, you're more likely to see a dog or a sun than a very rare breed of parakeet on a very particular sort of tree from another country. You're more likely to see common or archetypal symbols and remember them, and then they get passed on more than some of the very, very specific or particular ones. The more general symbols do get passed on. Here we also have the idea of a maze and a labyrinth, and there's slightly different things. Which is why I wanted them right next to each other and to look slightly different, slightly similar, but also slightly different. With a maze, we have a loss of direction, misdirection, going the wrong way, potential dead end, frustration. The maze is designed to confuse you. It's like the clouds, but it's more constructed. It's like someone is deliberately misdirecting you, or you have been put in a maze, say by your business, and they don't expect you to solve the problem or come out of it, or you're in an argument or a relationship that has become a maze. So there's a deliberation to that isn't present in the clouds. That's general confusion, general anxiety, general that's more like a inability to be able to navigate rather than an entire loss of direction that we see in the maze. Whereas the labyrinth is a more spiritual form of layout or plan, where we have spiritual direction, the pilgrim way, learning from experience, and this is more to keep on with your journey. Even if you don't quite know where you are in it, you are following a hidden pattern. So the labyrinth in the Cyberpunk Lenormand is my card to bring across the ideas of spiritual searching, being graced to be in the right place at the right time, even if you're not sure, because sometimes we just want some confirmation that what we're doing, even if it doesn't seem obvious, is actually part of our journey, something that we can learn from, and something that is a lot deeper than on the surface. So the labyrinth carries all of those meanings to me. In the next three cards, we have the crown, which is, again, a very common symbol. I also wanted to go with a symbol sort of like the mask, but more like a mirror. So I wanted as well to have something that very radically marked the cyberpunk genre of the cards within the cards themselves. So I went for mirror shades, which is also the name of one of the first anthologies of cyberpunk genre literature, so short stories and so forth. So mirror shades gets its place within the deck itself, as a nod to its inheritance from cyberpunk as well as the Game of Hope. And the gate is a very particular symbol that I wanted put in to go along with things like the ways and the garden and the key and the bridge symbols as transition points, because when we're doing a reading, quite often I find that if you don't have transition cards, the reading can become quite static. And it's a little bit like doing a countdown conundrum on television, where you ask for a lot of consonants but you don't have any vowels. So, or you're trying to play Scrabble and all you have is consonants. You need a few vowels in to make some words and sentences. And in divination, I think you need some transition cards, some movement cards, as well as the static cards that tell you this is your state, this is what you fear, this is how this is, and so on, and this is where the past is, and so on. It's far more useful in a dynamic reading, a useful reading to somebody, to have these transition cards in as well. So when I was looking at the overall language of the deck for the cyberpunk, I needed a couple of extra transitioning cards in order to make the language far more efficient and easily accessible and readable within the readings themselves. So it is really designed from practical experience to help you put together divination sentences, oracular sentences, from the understanding of the cards as a language themselves and as a balanced language with enough verbs, nouns, adjectives within the cards, so that you can make sense of any situation and speak to it. Because sometimes if you just designed a random oracle deck or cobbled together a number of random symbols and turned it into a deck for like an oracle deck or theme deck or something like that, it may not work very well in readings. And part of the reason sometimes for that, over the decades that I've played with different decks and so forth, is that it isn't constructed properly. It isn't constructed as a language. It's just constructed as a grab bag of symbols, and then it doesn't work really well in a reading. It could be a really beautiful deck or a really important theme, or it can be a very considered set of images, but it doesn't necessarily work for divination, because you need to have the deck as a language in order for that to happen. So here we have the crown, which is all about control, power, leadership, setting an example, mastery and or service, depending on its position and context with the question. And in the grand tableau, if you're using a large grand tableau for a reading. Again, in the standard deck, there isn't really a card other than the fox for like concepts that we'd have nowadays, as opposed to in sort of 1799 or something, where there weren't necessarily cards for self-empowerment, gaslighting, work-life balance, having riz or anything else. These concepts would be completely alien to that set of symbols. So I needed to put in, to bring it up to speed, at least one card for self-empowerment, for taking your destiny into your own hands. It's a little bit like the original readings for Lenormand often fretted about inheritance and your virtue and how that was seen from your family and things like that, which is far less important now than it was in the society and culture of that time. So The Crown for me carries a lot of the modernistic readings of that. I also wanted the child in it to be connected to almost like the tower construct, because again we've got a bit of a cyberpunk thing. Is the corporation controlling the people in this picture, or is the person actually beaming their thoughts to everyone else in some sort of gestalt? Where's authority? I think I wanted to be ambiguous in that card, so that we know that if you don't decide what to do, someone, or what to think, someone will decide it for you. And I think that's the import of that card. With Mirror Shades, this is all about your presentation, hiding the truth, casting shade, and being superficial. It's all about surface, basically. I wanted a card that would be able to tell people in a job question, a relationship question, in a self-examination question, that I wanted at least one card that was just, this is just what it appears to be. And if we were reading this for a person, it would be someone who has hidden shallownesses, that it's very superficial. I wanted something that was all face, a bit like the mask symbol, but obviously beefed up to a modernistic approach. And it's partly a sort of shadow card, in the sense of it sometimes shows our own vanity, our own weaknesses, the fact we're projecting into a situation something that is at odds within ourselves, and we're seeing that in the situation, and that's where the Mirror Shades card can show light or show shade onto ourself. With the Gate, as I mentioned, I wanted another transition card. I wanted several transition cards just to balance off the other cards, and the Gate is very important in our Cartier project, and in terms of our work with the Western Esoteric in History system, the Gate is a symbol of initiation. So it means that you're leaving your comfort zone, or need to leave your comfort zone. It's something new and unknown that you are moving into, that's not being brought to you. So this is the opposite end of the cards as the rider who brings something new to you. With the Gate, you are entering, or have the opportunity to enter something new. In a tarot equivalent, this is how I see the Four of Wands, as like an invitation, and a card as going into something new. So the Gate has a bit of commonality with the God and with the ways, as I mentioned, as movement cards, transition cards, and so forth. It can be an entrance or an exit, a little bit like the Book and the Key can be closed or open, depending on the rest of the context of the reading. And so in these three cards, cards 43, 44 and 45, I have the rose, because the rose is a symbol of your own self-worth, your own soul. It's a very spiritual symbol, as in the Rosicrucians, and it means we can have both the rose and the cross in the same deck. It means we can have the rose and the key in the same deck, which is very useful for our crossover to our Cartier and some of the initiatory stuff that I teach with regard to books like the Magister and occult order, the Order of Everlasting Day, where we actually practice Western esotericism. So I wanted to put some openings into some of the deeper stuff, the mystical stuff, the spiritual stuff that you can really read in a Lenormand reading with the cards as they are. I don't really follow the argument or discussion about Lenormand cards tell you it as it really is, whereas tarot is a lot more abstract. I've done very down-to-earth readings with tarot cards, and I've done very literal readings with tarot cards, and I've done very deep, profound, at least for the other person, or for myself in self-reading, readings with Lenormand cards. I think that they have that ability. It's the tool that can be applied to anything, really, depending on how you're using it, what you want to use it for. So with the rose, it can be just self-worth, but it can be something a lot deeper about the person's soul, their spirit, their mystical quest, and so forth, how their soul is unfolding in the world around it. With the font, this is a similar card again, like we saw with the maze and the labyrinth. The font and the fountain are sort of two sides of perhaps the same coin. The font is where you pull your dedication from. It's a card that you can have a new life after an upheaval. It's like literally the card that doesn't appear after the tower, although I guess the star does, which is similar to the font, I guess, if we were going to pull the analogies apart between the two systems. But the font is about dedicating yourself to something, consecrating yourself to something, that you stand up and be counted. And you draw all of this up, like the font is drawing all of this up out into the world. And so depending again on the reading, it could be you doing that or a need for you to actually do that and to see what is what you're going to draw up, what you're going to pull up as a result of the situation that's going on. With the fountain, this is more like a flow. Basically, if that was to have an alternate name, it would be the flow. The fountain is a steady stream of information. It's being at the right time at the right place and so forth. It's about being able to sustain yourself in a way that you didn't think was possible. It's an enthusiasm for things. If it was in a relationship, the fountain would be a beautiful card for, the relationship has its own direction. It has its own flow. It is just flowing. Say the alternate title for that card could be the flow as opposed to the fountain. And I've used the sense of data fountain actually coming down, and you have the opportunity to step into the stream of the fountain, sort of bathe in it and benefit from that. So again, there are slight overlaps with the font, but they are very different cards as well. And then very finally, I wanted three very, very, very big ideas into the deck, which is to have a card for the reader, a card for the sitter, and a card for time itself. And so these were the final three cards that I wanted. I love the Platonic idea and the quote in Timaeus that time is the moving likeness of eternity. I've always found that the most succinct description of what time is and what existence is that it is a moving likeness of eternity, because eternity doesn't have time, it doesn't have space. The divine is all as the recent film said, everything is happening always at the same time at once, or whatever. Everything always at once, and our general world appears to be linear time. So I wanted a card that was both transcendent of that, yet popped up in the reading to tell you it was time to do something. You were running out of time, or it was the right time for something to happen, or perhaps if the time card is far distant from you, then it's not yet time for that to happen. So I wanted a timing card into the deck that was both very abstract and yet very useful at the same time. And the same for the symbolism for the reader and the sitter. You could use those in a self-reading. You could use those to represent the person themselves in addition to the male or female cards. And I wanted a sort of very neutral symbol for the sitter and the reader as well, hence they are both masked. And with the reader, it can stand for divination itself. Very few divination decks have a card in for divination itself, like you might want to find some other divination for this question. Or divination might be important for you, or divination might be something that you shouldn't do for a reading. So I wanted a card, a self-referential card within the cards themselves. The same with the sitter. This can be questioning, being open, having curiosity, getting advice from experience. That's a similar thing, I guess, to the Hierophant card. All of that comes into it. And it can also represent out-of-the-box thinking that the sitter doesn't have, but it's found within the rest of the reading itself. So I hope with those cards, with those 12 cards, it both explores a little bit about the roots of the system, some of the concepts that underpin divination itself, but more importantly, provide a few more practical keys within a divination that you can actually make it far more accessible. I've chosen these from experience. I want to be able to read with this deck, and I want to be able to read well and quickly and effortlessly with the deck. So it just needed a little few tweaks to the language, almost like captions or subtitles, that we could throw in with the deck, and then they will help us actually open up the reading from each of these cards should they appear in the reading. Now, the way to actually use the cards, the extra cards, is you can shuffle the entire deck and then only select out 36 for the grand tableau, and then maybe read the ones that haven't turned up in the reading separately if you would want to do that. You could also select out 12 cards at random and then only shuffle 36 and use those if you're doing a grand tableau. You could chop and change, like maybe the person I don't know, didn't want to know about one particular subject, but did really want you to focus on, say, timing. So you definitely put the time card in and take maybe the clouds card out. It would depend on the circumstances, but what I've tried to do is make these open for experimentation as well. So I hope that encourages you to back the Kickstarter. If you're thinking about backing the Kickstarter, we have 7 days remaining at the time of recording, or I hope that it's given you some insight as to why the history of the so-called Lenormand deck has allowed us to open it up to have plenty more cards and to chop and change the symbolism. If, for example, the publishing company who had chosen the Dead Man's deck 50 years later to pretend was the deck used by Mademoiselle Lenormand had used the coffee cards, you'd actually have 2 trees cards. You'd have a beast card, a lion card, and there'd be certain cards that wouldn't have made the cut, and we'd be talking about an entirely different so-called tradition or the standard set of cards. It was only one game removed from being a very, not very different, but a slightly different set of cards. So I don't feel as beholden to the structure of Lenormand as I might do with Tarot, that's established itself over a longer period of time based on a more convoluted or tight set of structures. Why it's 78 cards, why it's 36 cards, you might as well ask why is the relationship of the measurements of a circle hold to pi. It's just the fact that the universe is built like that, and that's the universe we're in, and these are the cards that will that have stabilized themselves in a format that actually ties in and unlocks the universe around us, because it's based on exactly the same principles as everything is. Okay, thanks a lot for listening.